Why do people like totalitarianism? What could possibly be the honest philosophical justifications for a system like that? How could you think that it possibly works when we see Nazi Germany and Maoist China and Soviet Russia all failing? You know? Well, the answer to these questions lies in the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, who is one of the earliest, most interesting and most controversial political thinkers ever. So, who was he? He was born in 1588 and spent a lot of his life in academia. He studied at Oxford, he tutored, he met figures like René Descartes and Galileo. But these weren't the defining events in his life. The ultimate thing that forged his political ideas was the English Civil War. This was a war that broke out in England in the 17th century, basically about whether they should govern themselves with a monarchy or with a parliament. Thomas Hobbes was afraid he'd die in this war because of his pro-monarchist views, so he fled to Paris. And there he wrote a book called Leviathan, in which he outlined his political philosophy, in which he tried to justify absolute monarchy, what we would call today totalitarianism, authoritarianism, maybe even fascism. Okay? Now, what's so fascinating about this book is that most kind of manifestos about this sort of thing are about justifying a power fantasy. You know, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf not as an honest philosophical thesis, but as a propaganda piece. Hobbes here isn't trying to do any of that. He hasn't got any selfish motivations. He is writing this book to save humanity from itself. He genuinely believes that this is the ultimate per political system. So how did he justify totalitarianism? I mean, like, try to. I don't support them. Anyway, how did he try to justify totalitarianism? So his argument begins with this question: what is man like in the state of nature? That is to ask, what are we like when we have no society, no technology, no culture, no economy, nothing, and we're just trying to survive? What are we naturally like? Well, Hobbes argues that we are absolutely destitute. He says verbatim, one of his most famous lines: life in the state of nature is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. We are naturally evil, dispositioned to act absolutely selfishly, regardless of how other people feel. And you might hear this and think, well, I don't act selfishly, or at least I try not to. Like that's not how I naturally feel like I am. But this misinterprets Hobbes, because he says we're only like this in the state of nature. The reason why we're not like this on a daily basis is because of something called social contracts. So social contracts are like, I will give you my wheat farm if you give me your oxen. I will not kill you if you don't kill me. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? They are agreements. They are social contracts. And Hobbes says that, yeah, this is what people naturally form in the state of nature. Because we have this drive to escape it. We have a drive to get out, escape the incredible amount of suffering we experience there, and have a better life. So we'll have people forming laws, making agreements, socializing, and then, oh shit, before you know it, we have a society. So what do we do now that we have our social contracts all set up perfectly? Well, we have two options. We can either have a libertarian government emphasizing freedom, or we can have a totalitarian government emphasizing order. Which one is the right option, according to Hobbes? It is, well, according to him, the libertarian government is a stupid idea. Because although freedom is nice, it makes people much happier, it inevitably leads to bloodshed and civil war and death. Because people are able to speak out regardless of whether or not that their opinions are valid, and then go against our social contracts that we work so hard to build, and go back to the state of nature. Now, this is an absolute disaster for Hobbes, because the only reason we should have a government, in his opinion, is to prevent us from deteriorating back into the state of nature. And the only way to do this, supposedly, is to have an authoritarian government. So we get an absolute sovereign ruler who cracks down on free speech, makes laws about everything, polices everything, comes down harshly on any kind of deviance or crime, just whips everybody into order, like a strict parent controlling a toddler. Now, his authority is absolute and irrefutable. People supposedly have no right to revolutions, and the only scenario where they do is when the sovereign can't protect them and needs to be replaced by a new one. And if this sounds to you just like George Orwell's 1984, then well done. You're 100% correct. That is the perfect interpretation of Thomas Hobbes's political for philosophy. It is quintessential kind of Orwellian authoritarianism. It's quite dark. But what I find so interesting about it is its intentions, right? Like, it's not about him. It's like I said earlier, it's not about his ego. He genuinely thinks that this is the only way to protect people from themselves in society. And regardless of whether or not that's correct, I think that's a really fascinating view, you know? But all of this begs the question of whether or not it works. Like, does he succeed in justifying some 1984-esque state? Or should we be content with the democracies that we generally have in the West? Well, personally, I think his most tenuous assumption is that man is actually like that in the state of nature. Like, how do we really know? Like, we don't really have much to go off in terms of what exactly we were like before society was around, because, like, yeah, it was such a long time ago. And there's things like, you know, the evidence for how cave people cared for the disabled, which point to a more kind of optimistic view of the state of nature shared by thinkers like Locke. And also, I really don't like his emphasis on avoiding that. I think that, yes, it is a bad thing, but, you know, as Thomas Aquinas said, or might have said, I'm not sure, the highest goal of a captain isn't to preserve his ship, because then he just never leave port. Like, we need to... There is more to living than just surviving, than just avoiding dissatisfaction. You know? Because, yeah, I think that libertarianism is more accepting of the fact that dissatisfaction is just an inevitable part of life rather than a thing that you can avoid. And Hobbes does acknowledge that, you know, life in his state would be absolutely miserable. But his argument is that the state of nature is more miserable. I ask if that matters, you know? So anyway, the most important question is, what do we learn from Thomas Hobbes? I think that we learn how society comes together through trust and mutual agreement. We learn how a man's life can influence his philosophy. And most importantly, we learn that the most batshit insane ideas, including totalitarianism, are worth engaging with on a philosophical level. Thank you.